Tonight we're pulling back the curtains on a world few truly understand. Not the generals, not the secret meetings, not the nuclear tension. We're talking about the ordinary people of the Soviet Union. What they ate, what they wore, how they laughed, how they loved. This isn't the history from textbooks. This is the life behind the Iron Curtain. You'll walk through their kitchens, ride with them on crowded buses, stand in line at the bakery, visit their schools, their factories, their parks, and by the end, you might just realize how similar we all are in the quiet hours of the day. Before you get comfortable, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and drop your city name and local time in the comments so we know exactly where in the world you're watching us from. The alarm buzzes in a small shared apartment in Leningrad. It is 6 a.m. and the winter sun has not yet risen. The radiator hisses, but the room remains cold. A mother stirs first, pulling on thick woolen socks and wrapping a scarf around her head. Her husband is already sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes and preparing for another long day ahead. They are one of many Soviet families living in a kommunalka, a communal apartment where multiple households share a kitchen, a bathroom, and even a phone, if they are lucky enough to have one. Life in the Soviet Union was built around routine and collective discipline. People woke early because work and school started early. Trains, trams, and buses filled with bundled figures moved through snow and fog toward factories, offices, and schools. Public transportation was a lifeline in Soviet cities, and though often crowded, it was reliable enough to serve the massive working population. A child might wave goodbye to his parents as he leaves for school alone with a metal lunchbox and a small satchel of books strapped to his back. Breakfast was a simple and predictable meal for most Soviet citizens: bread with butter or jam, maybe some porridge known as kasha, and black tea, served in a glass held in a metal podstakanik, a traditional tea glass holder. Some mornings, if the family was lucky, there might be an egg or a slice of sausage, but those were not guaranteed. For many, life was about making do with what was available, and rationing was deeply familiar to those who had lived through the post-war years. After breakfast, the rhythm of daily life truly began. For adults, this meant heading to work at the factory, the office, or the local school. The Soviet workforce was made up of engineers, teachers, doctors, nurses, assembly line workers, farmers, janitors, and thousands of other professions. Women were a massive part of the labor force, often juggling full-time jobs with domestic responsibilities. This was considered a point of pride and equality in the Soviet system, though in practice, it left many women exhausted. Factory life was not glamorous, but it was central to the identity of the Soviet worker. Long rows of machines, harsh lighting, and the constant hum of labor defined the setting. Workers wore uniforms or coveralls, depending on the industry, and they clocked in with military-like precision. Managers oversaw production quotas, and charts showing productivity were pinned on walls as constant reminders of goals that had to be met or exceeded. Not meeting a quota could bring serious consequences, and sometimes public criticism in the form of group meetings or reports. Meanwhile, in schools across the nation, students gathered in uniform rows, wore black dresses with white collars, and boys wore buttoned shirts and ties or pioneer neck scarves if they were part of the Young Pioneers. A Soviet youth organization. Classes began with a greeting to the teacher and to Lenin, whose portrait often hung above the blackboard. The curriculum emphasized math, science, Russian language, literature, and Marxist-Leninist ideology. History was taught through the lens of party achievement and patriotic heroism. There was little room for questioning the past or alternative viewpoints. Lunchtime varied, depending on where you were. Factory workers might receive a hot meal in the cafeteria, known as a stolovaya, where cabbage soup, buckwheat, and meat cutlets were common fare. School children often had soup and bread with a compote drink made from boiled fruit. Office workers sometimes packed their own meals or ate at nearby diners. Long lines were common everywhere, and waiting in them was simply a part of life. You waited for food, for shoes, for tickets, for books. You learned patience, whether you liked it or not. Afternoons continued the structured pace. Adults returned to their workplaces. Students resumed their studies or participated in organized after-school activities. These included chess clubs, dance classes, athletic programs, or music lessons provided through state-run institutions. The Soviet state believed in cultivating young minds and bodies, not just for their own benefit, but for the future strength of the socialist system. A strong body, a sharp mind, and a loyal heart were the ideal combination. By late afternoon and early evening, families began to return home. The apartment corridors filled with the sound of boots being kicked off, pots clanging in shared kitchens, and the occasional argument over who had not cleaned the sink again. Parents helped children with homework or practiced songs and poems for school performances. Some turned on the radio to listen to music or state-approved programming. Television was becoming more common, but most homes only had one if they were lucky, and the selection was limited to channels that followed strict guidelines from the OI. Ministry of Culture. Dinner was again simple and practical: boiled potatoes, cabbage dishes, pasta with butter, or canned fish from the Far East. Once in a while, there might be a treat like a piece of chocolate or a small cake picked up from a bakery on the way. Home dessert was not a daily affair, but rather an occasional joy to be shared. On birthdays, holidays, or when rations were slightly more generous, children often remembered these small pleasures with warmth and nostalgia. Evenings were a time for rest, but also for social activity. Neighbors might gather for tea in one of the communal kitchens, telling stories or discussing the news as carefully as possible, since not everyone could be trusted. Friends met for walks or visits, while elders knitted or played cards under the light of a single lamp. In larger cities, people attended theaters or concerts filled with patriotic music, and state-sanctioned art forms of entertainment were always monitored, but within those boundaries, culture flourished in its own way. Weekends offered a small break from the grind. Saturday was still often a half workday depending on the job, but Sunday was officially a day off. Families might visit parks, museums, or take a trip to a local dacha, a small country house with a garden attached. Gardening was not just a hobby, it was a way to supplement food supplies with potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, and berries. Entire families worked the land together, planting, weeding, and harvesting through the seasons. Religion was officially discouraged, but not erased in secret or quiet ways. Some families continued to observe traditions, like Easter or Christmas, though these were referred to in more cultural than spiritual terms. Public religious expression was limited, and many churches were closed or repurposed. Still, in private, some lit candles or whispered prayers, especially the older generations who remembered life before the revolution. Despite the control, despite the propaganda, despite the shortages, there was community, there was pride in labor, there was love between family members, and there was resilience in the face of challenge. Soviet life was not easy, and it was not glamorous, but it was rich in structure and filled with human effort and connection. These were lives lived not in defiance of the system, but within it, shaped by rules and limitations, but also by dreams, however quiet they might have been. A Soviet citizen woke each morning not just to face another day of labor, but to fulfill a role in what was called the Grand Socialist Project. From the moment a person left their home and stepped into the snowy street or dusty path, depending on the season, they were part of something bigger than themselves. It did not matter if they were sweeping floors, welding steel, teaching physics, or nursing patients. Everyone had a purpose, or so they were told, and the state took pride in reminding its citizens that every single job contributed to the strength of the collective. The Soviet workday usually started early and ended late. 8 hours were standard, but overtime was common and not always optional. In industrial cities like Magnitogorsk and Novosibirsk, the rhythm of factory life was relentless. Men and women entered massive industrial complexes, filled with the sounds of grinding metal and hissing. Steam carrying lunch pails and wearing heavy uniforms, often patched and worn from. Years of use supervisors greeted them at the gates, noting who arrived late and who showed signs of slowing down. Productivity reports hung near the entrances, and workers studied them, quietly aware that falling short might mean more than just embarrassment. It could mean a lecture from the brigade, or worse, an invitation to a disciplinary meeting where excuses held little weight in the offices of Moscow and Leningrad. The pace felt different, but the expectations were just as high. Typewriters clacked rhythmically as clerks and typists prepared endless reports and records. Meetings were common and filled with formal language, praising the party's latest goals or analyzing shortages that were never described as failures, just temporary setbacks. There were jokes among coworkers shared in whispers about how the 5-year plans were more like 10-year dreams, but these jokes never left the room. The walls had ears, or so everyone believed, and self-censorship became second nature. Soviet workers were grouped into brigades or collectives, which were more than just teams. They were small social units where trust and pressure existed in equal measure. Within these brigades, workers often competed for rewards based on productivity. These rewards included public praise, certificates of excellence, medals, sometimes even a television set, or a rare opportunity to travel within the USSR. The most successful workers were given the title Hero of Socialist Labor, and their photos were displayed proudly in hallways and newsletters. These awards were meant to inspire others to work harder and believe in the system. But not all jobs were about medals and recognition. Across the Soviet Union, there were millions who swept streets, cleaned stairwells, washed uniforms, or stood in food lines for hours simply to bring home bread for their families. These were invisible workers, often forgotten by history, but their contributions were no less essential. A woman cleaning the corridors of a hospital might hum a folk song while mopping. A man collecting trash might nod politely to neighbors without saying much. Everyone understood their role. Everyone knew they were part of a whole on collective. Farms work began at sunrise and often did not end until the sky darkened completely. In rural areas like the Ukrainian steppe or the forests of Belarus, men and women tilled the land with tractors and scythes, planted seeds in carefully measured rows, and gathered crops under the eyes of local officials, who kept detailed records of yields. Children often helped in the fields, learning early that food did not come easily. They tied bundles of hay, collected eggs from hens, or watered vegetables grown in long rows behind modest houses, even in rural regions where modern equipment was lacking. The push to produce never slowed. Despite the pressure, there was pride too. For many, especially those raised after the Second World War, work was not just duty, it was identity. A steelworker was not just someone who bent metal, they were a builder of the nation. A teacher was not just an educator, they were shaping the next generation of comrades. The slogans painted on factory walls and school entrances were everywhere. Work is honor, labor is glory. The party is the mind, honor, and conscience of our era. These words were repeated so often that even skeptics began to recite them, if only to avoid suspicion. Within this environment came the phenomenon of subotniks and voskresniks. These were voluntary workdays on Saturdays or Sundays when citizens were encouraged and sometimes required to perform extra labor for the good of society. It might involve cleaning public spaces, fixing broken infrastructure, or planting trees in parks, though promoted as noble contributions to the socialist, because many saw them as unpaid obligations. Participation was expected and absence noticed. Still, they created moments of camaraderie and even humor as coworkers wielded shovels and rakes instead of typewriters. And tools unions existed, but unlike in capitalist countries, they were not adversarial. Instead, they functioned more like extensions of the state, organizing holiday events, arranging access to sanatoriums for health breaks, and distributing movie tickets or vacation vouchers. They did not strike or protest. They coordinated and supported. The idea was that the state and the worker were on the same side, so no conflict needed to exist. This was, of course, more ideal than reality, and quiet dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface, though rarely voiced aloud. Vacations were considered essential for health and morale. Every citizen was entitled to a rest period each year, and many took trips to the Black Sea coast or health resorts in the Caucasus. These vacations were organized through trade unions and workplaces, with lodging, meals, and sometimes even massage therapy included. The goal was to rest the body and return to work refreshed. Some brought home seashells from Sochi or bottles of mineral water from the Caucasus Mountains as souvenirs of the few precious weeks they spent away from labor. Children, too, were integrated into the work culture from an early age, not through actual labor, but through structure, discipline, and ideological education. At summer camps like Artek or Olyonok, children marched in uniforms, sang patriotic songs, and participated in group activities that emphasized unity and hard work. These camps were both a reward and a training ground for future Soviet citizens. They swam in lakes, performed in plays, and wrote letters to factory workers, thanking them for their sacrifices. There was joy in these places, but it was a joy wrapped in red banners and watched over by careful eyes. For women, the workday did not end when they left the factory or office. It continued at home with cooking, cleaning, washing, and raising children. Even with state-provided kindergartens and school meals, domestic labor fell heavily on women's shoulders in apartment kitchens. They stirred soup while listening to the radio, ironed shirts with heavy metal irons, and sewed buttons late into the night. Their strength was rarely praised in newspapers, but everyone knew it held the household together. The dream of the Soviet Union was not one of individual wealth or personal luxury. It was a vision of collective achievement, shared success, and equal sacrifice. For some, that dream felt real, especially when they remembered the hunger of the war years or the chaos of the past. For others, it was an illusion they could not escape. Either way, work shaped every corner of Soviet life, from the assembly line to the classroom, from the village field to the scientific institute. The rhythm of labor kept the machine of the Union moving. There was pride in small victories, a repaired radio, a student who passed her exams, a machine that ran smoothly all week, a neighbor who shared their sugar ration when yours ran out. These moments made the hardship more bearable. They gave meaning to routine and allowed Soviet citizens to carry on with their heads held high. Behind the thick concrete walls of Soviet apartment blocks lay the heart of daily life for millions of citizens. These apartments, known as Khrushchevkas and later Brezhnev, were more than just places to sleep. They were shared spaces of joy, frustration, privacy, and public life all rolled into one. For families lucky enough to have their own flat, privacy was a luxury. For many others, the kommunalka, or communal apartment, was the only option, where one room served as a bedroom, dining area, and living room for an entire family. Stepping into a Soviet home, you would first notice the simplicity. Everything had a function. The hallway might contain a coat rack overflowing with jackets, scarves, and galoshes. A narrow mirror hung beside it, sometimes cracked or slightly crooked. Shoes were often removed at the door to keep the floors clean, especially in winter when snow and mud clung to the soles. A faded rug led you to the main room, where a fold-out couch doubled as a bed, and a wooden table stood ready for both meals and schoolwork. Furniture was often inherited or issued through the state. The iconic redwood wall unit known as a Stenka dominated the living room, storing everything from plates and crystal glasses to books, photo albums, and television sets. A small black and white TV rested on one shelf, a prized possession, even if it only received a few channels. Families would gather around it in the evenings, adjusting the antenna to reduce the static as they watched programs about heroic soldiers, patriotic children, or occasional cartoons in the kitchen. The scene was one of organized chaos, shared by several families in a kommunalka or privately used in a small flat. The kitchen was always busy as samovar for boiling. Water, a gas stove with enamel pots, and a table covered in oilcloth made up the core elements. If there was a refrigerator, it was often old and noisy, humming in the corner like a sleeping animal. Families used whatever space they could find for. Storage bags of buckwheat, glass jars of pickled vegetables, and loaves of dark rye bread lined the cabinets or sat on windowsills in winter to stay cool morning. Rituals began early. A mother heated tea on the stove while her children dressed in. Layers against the cold, her husband might sit quietly reading the Pravda newspaper, his expression serious as he scanned headlines, praising the success of the latest tractor factory or the bravery of cosmonauts. Meanwhile, the radio played softly, in the background, announcing the time and weather, reminding citizens of important events, and occasionally broadcasting. Classical music or marshes cleaning was an everyday task, especially in shared spaces. Women often took on the responsibility, sweeping floors with handmade brooms, washing laundry by hand in bathtubs or community sinks and hanging it to dry on lines stretched across the kitchen or balconies. Soap was rationed and precious, used sparingly and with care. A washboard might still be found in older homes, its ridges worn smooth from years of scrubbing. If a family was lucky, they owned a small electric washing machine, but most still relied on muscle and patience. Bathing was a weekly ritual for many. Families who did not have their own bathrooms relied on public bathhouses or banyas, where they followed ancient traditions of steam, heat, and cold water. The experience was part hygiene, part social gathering, with men and women in separate sections sitting on wooden benches, sweating, cleansing, and beating their skin gently with birch branches known as veniki. It was a moment of relaxation and connection to older Russian customs that persisted through the decades. Children played in the courtyards between apartment blocks. These playgrounds were made of metal slides, swings, and climbing frames, painted in bright colors, often chipped and rusting, but still full of life. Games like hide and seek, tag, and jumping rope filled the air with laughter even in winter, when breath came out in clouds and snowballs flew through the air. In warmer months, children gathered dandelions, chased butterflies, or played soccer with whatever ball they could find inside the apartment children's rooms, if they had one. Were small and multi-purpose. A single desk might hold textbooks, pencils, and a small reading lamp, while a shelf displayed plastic toys or dolls gifted on birthdays. A school bag hung neatly on the wall beside their pioneer scarf, and a portrait of Lenin or Gagarin might be pinned above the bed, reminding the child of the heroes they were meant to admire. Homework was done with focus and care, knowing teachers expected precision, and obedience. Meals were central to family life, though ingredients were not always easy to find. Mothers and grandmothers became experts in making the most of what was available. Soup was a staple, whether made from cabbage, beetroot, potatoes, or barley, served hot with a dollop of sour cream. It filled stomachs and warmed hands. Bread was never wasted. The crusts were used in soup or fed to birds, and even stale slices could be fried with eggs or turned into breadcrumbs for cooking. Conversation during meals was a careful dance. Parents spoke softly about work, children shared stories from school, and sometimes grandparents reminisced about life before the revolution or during the war. But everyone knew what could be said and what must be left unspoken. Neighbors were friendly, but also cautious. Gossip could spread quickly, and one careless comment might bring trouble. A friend who suddenly stopped visiting a coworker who was transferred without warning. These were reminders that the walls could listen, and silence was sometimes the safest answer. Evening brought a rhythm of small pleasures, tea in glasses with lemon or sugar cubes crumbling slowly. Family members might sit together, reading aloud from a worn book, playing checkers, or listening to vinyl records on an old gramophone if they had one. The voices of actors and musicians filled the rooms with theater and song, turning tiny homes into places of magic and escape in those quiet hours. The outside world faded, and what remained was the comfort of routine, the soft rustle of pages, the ticking of a wall clock, and the warmth of shared presence on weekends. Families might attempt to go shopping a task requiring stamina and planning. Long lines wrapped around stores, especially if word spread that a new shipment of butter sausage or shoes had arrived. People brought string bags folded in pockets, known as avaskas, in case something unexpected was available to buy. There was always a sense of urgency because items disappeared fast. The shelves might hold only canned fish vinegar and pickles one day and suddenly be full the next, with sweets, flour, or imported oranges from Cuba. Celebrations were deeply important and often prepared for weeks in advance. Birthdays were modest, but full of love. A homemade cake, a bottle of sweet wine, and a handful of friends or relatives transformed an ordinary evening into a cherished memory. Soviet holidays, like New Year's Day, were grand affairs with decorated fir trees, gifts for children, and tables piled with salads, smoked meats, and candies. Homemade decorations, tinsel garlands, and paper snowflakes filled every corner while families watched the annual New Year's broadcast featuring music and speeches. Weddings were joyful and full of tradition. A ceremony at the local registry office, followed by photos near monuments or parks, and a reception in a relative's apartment or rented hall. The bride wore white if she could afford it, and the groom often borrowed a suit. Guests brought gifts wrapped in colorful paper and filled the room with laughter, toasts, and dancing. Toasts were long, full of poetry and praise, celebrating love, unity, and the strength of a collective family. Even in times of scarcity, people found ways to create beauty and meaning. Homemade crafts, embroidered linens, painted wooden spoons, and matryoshka dolls filled shelves and drawers. Women knitted sweaters from scratch, mended torn socks, and sewed school uniforms to save money and express creativity. Potted plants sat on windowsills, adding green to gray spaces, and photos of family members, some framed, some tucked behind mirrors, told stories of generations past and present. Home was not just a shelter in the Soviet Union. It was a small world, carefully built and fiercely protected within the limits allowed by the state. It held warmth, laughter, struggle, and tradition. It was where tea was poured, homework was done, and life unfolded in quiet, steady beats. It was a space where people dreamed quietly, loved deeply, and endured with dignity. To understand Soviet daily life, you must begin with a simple truth. The act of acquiring food was not just a task. It was a strategy, a routine, a part-time job, and at times even a battle. It began with rumors and phone calls. Whispered words passed from neighbor to neighbor. The bakery on Lenina Street has fresh loaves. The dairy stand has milk. The department store might have sausages this afternoon. Grab your bag and go quickly before the line gets too long. Lines were everywhere in the early morning as the city still woke. Grandmothers bundled in shawls and thick coats queued outside grocery stores. Their hands held numbered tokens or pieces of paper they had written down for order, while their feet stomped to stay warm. These were not just lines for luxuries. They were for butter, eggs, meat, or sometimes just cabbage. The key was patience and persistence. People brought stools, books, knitting projects. They chatted quietly, or sometimes stood in silence, eyes scanning for signs of delivery trucks pulling into back alleys in cities. The situation varied. Some stores received more than others, depending on political connections or proximity to government offices. In small towns, the options were limited to local produce and whatever shipments happened to arrive that week. There were times when shelves sat nearly empty for days, holding only jars of vinegar, tins of canned fish, or pasta stacked in odd quantities. The unpredictability of stock meant families always bought what they could when they saw it, even if they did not need it immediately, because tomorrow it might vanish again. Once inside the store, there was another routine. The counter system was not self-service. Instead, you told the shop assistant what you wanted. She weighed your items, scribbled prices on a piece of paper, and sent you to the cashier. You paid separately, then returned with the receipt to collect your items. It was a dance of steps memorized from childhood, and every Soviet citizen knew the rhythm. Even children who stood on tiptoe to reach the counters with coins clutched in their small hands. Markets offered slightly more variety, but at higher prices. Farmers and villagers would bring their goods to open-air bazaars selling everything from potatoes and beets to berries, honey, and sunflower seeds. Quality was often better than in state stores, and sometimes even included delicacies like smoked fish or fresh cheese. But not everyone could afford to shop there regularly, and haggling was part of the process. Sellers wrapped purchases in old newspapers or pages torn from magazines, and customers carried them home in woven baskets or cloth sacks. Inside the home meals were made with care and invention. Soviet cuisine was hearty, simple, and built around what was available. Potatoes, cabbage, onions, carrots, and beets formed the base of countless dishes. Meat was precious and often stretched across several meals. A single chicken might become soup one night, baked legs the next, and salad with chopped pieces for the third. Salads themselves were a staple, not like garden salads, but dense creations with mayonnaise, boiled eggs, peas, and root vegetables. The most famous was Olivier salad, a New Year tradition made with potatoes, carrots, sausage, pickles, and mayonnaise. Bread was sacred. It came in large loaves, often rye or dark wheat, sliced thickly and never wasted. If a piece fell to the floor, it was picked up quickly and kissed in a silent gesture of respect. It was used to soak up soup, eat with tea, or pair with simple toppings like butter, sugar, or tomato paste. Fried bread slices made easy snacks, and croutons for soup. Even the stale end pieces were ground into breadcrumbs for frying. Tea was the drink of choice. Almost universally, a steaming glass of black tea served in a metal podstakanik was present at every meal and every conversation. Served plain or with lemon and sugar, it was more than a beverage. It was a ritual. Friends gathered around the kitchen table and spoke softly, sipping slowly while watching the steam curl in the air. Tea warmed hands and comforted spirits, especially in the long winter evenings. Sugar was rationed and treated carefully. It was stored in glass jars labeled with handwritten stickers, and children were taught not to sneak spoonfuls unless they wanted a firm lesson in fairness. A small sugar cube held between the teeth while sipping tea was a trick passed down from grandparents as a way to make the sweetness last longer. If you were truly lucky, you might have jam to stir into your tea, homemade from apples, cherries, or blackcurrants, and stored in recycled jars lined up neatly on pantry shelves. Preserving food was a seasonal ritual. Every summer and autumn, families turned to the task of pickling and canning, filling jars with cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, and cabbage, seasoned with garlic, dill, and vinegar. These jars were sealed with metal lids and boiled in large pots, then stored on balconies, under beds, or in cellars to be opened in the long winter months. The pop of a jar being opened in January carried with it the memory of sunlight and summer. Gardens, meal times were sacred moments of gathering. Families arranged their schedules around them. Parents returned from work. Children came home from school, and the table became the center of the universe. Meals were eaten together without distractions. The table might be small and the dishes humble, but the company was rich and full of quiet gratitude. Everyone had a place and a role. One set the table, another poured tea. The youngest offered slices of bread with a proud smile. Conversations during meals were both warm and cautious. Stories from the day were shared, lessons, repeated laughter exchanged, but always with an awareness that some topics were off limits: politics, religion, deep complaints about shortages or leadership. These were subjects for whispered private moments, not the dinner table. Even children learned this code quickly, instinctively, knowing when to change the subject or lower their voices. Special occasions brought out hidden treasures. A wedding, a promotion, a visit from distant relatives triggered a flurry of activity. A white tablecloth appeared from storage. The best dishes came down from the cupboard, glasses filled with compote, or if it was a true celebration, Soviet champagne, or Georgian wine. Bowls overflowed with pickled mushrooms beet salad, and perhaps a rare meat pie made with careful attention and much anticipation. These feasts were acts of joy and pride, moments of color and abundance in a world of gray routine. For children, treats were remembered vividly. A piece of chocolate from the Red October factory, a caramel wrapped in shiny paper, a fruit drink from a glass bottle with a thick straw. These were not everyday items, and their rarity made them magical. A child might save a single piece of candy for days, showing it to friends and deciding when the perfect moment had arrived to unwrap and enjoy. It fully even birthdays were modest, but meaningful. A simple homemade cake, sometimes baked with dried fruit or nuts, topped with whipped cream or chocolate glaze, formed the centerpiece of the celebration. The child received small gifts, often practical. Clothes, a new book, or a toy car, and the room was filled with balloons and handmade signs drawn with crayons by siblings and classmates. The joy was not in extravagance, but in shared effort and love. Shopping for clothes and shoes was another test of patience and timing. Clothing stores were filled with rows of similar items, all produced by state factories, and often lacking variety. You wore what was available, not necessarily what you wanted. Sizes were approximate, and tailoring was a luxury. If a shipment of boots arrived, people ran through the streets, calling neighbors and lining up, hoping to find their size before stock ran out. Some families made their own clothes, using patterns passed between friends and sewing machines that were passed down like family heirlooms. In this world, where so many items were scarce, nothing was taken for granted. A jar of mayonnaise, a new winter coat, a pair of imported jeans, all carried a weight of meaning and significance. People helped one another, shared tips, and sometimes offered their place in line to someone more in need. The phrase "get it while you can" was more than advice. It was a survival tactic. Yet, despite the shortages, the waiting, and the unpredictability, life continued with grace and dignity. People celebrated when they could, laughed often, and found meaning in small victories. A successful dinner, a jar that sealed properly, a kind gesture from a neighbor. These were the moments that sustained daily life behind the curtain of ideology and scarcity. From the moment a Soviet child could walk and speak, they were gently yet firmly steered toward becoming a future builder of socialism. Childhood in the Soviet Union was not a time of idle play and careless freedom. It was a time of shaping minds, strengthening bodies, and preparing souls for the long journey of collective responsibility. The state watched over children, not as a distant guardian, but as a close and ever-present influence, guiding them through every step of their development. Day began early for most Soviet children, whether they lived in the dense neighborhoods of Leningrad or the quiet rural villages of Siberia. Their mornings followed a rhythm that echoed across the nation. A mother or grandmother woke them gently, sometimes with a song or the smell of porridge wafting from the kitchen. After washing up at the sink, often with cold water, and brushing their teeth with plain soap or a chalky toothpaste, they dressed in school uniforms, polished shoes, and bright red pioneer scarves tied neatly around their necks. School uniforms were symbols of pride and order. Girls wore black dresses with white collars, sometimes with lace aprons on special days. Boys wore dark trousers, crisp shirts, and if they had one, a formal jacket with shiny brass buttons. The pioneer scarf was more than decoration. It marked a child as part of the Young Pioneers, a youth organization modeled after communist ideals and filled with rituals that instilled obedience, patriotism, and teamwork. The walk to school was brisk and determined. Children carried satchels filled with notebooks, pencils, rulers, and textbooks, carefully covered in brown paper to keep them clean. They passed familiar shops, apartment blocks, and statues of Lenin standing tall in every town square. By the time they arrived, the school bell rang, not just to begin the day, but to signal a transformation from individual to collective. Each student was not just a child, but a future citizen of the USSR. Inside The classroom discipline reigned. The teacher, often called ukatel or uchitelnitsa, was a figure of deep respect and occasional fear. She entered the room to the class, standing in unison, greeting her with hands at their sides and eyes forward. Lessons began immediately, usually with math or Russian language drills. Children recited multiplication tables, recited poems from Pushkin, and copied dictations in careful cursive script. Mistakes were corrected in red ink, and praised for improvement was given sparingly, but with deep meaning when earned history. Lessons focused on the glories of the October Revolution, the heroism of Red Army soldiers, and the achievements of Soviet scientists and cosmonauts. The names of Lenin, Marx, and Gagarin were spoken often and with reverence. The past was taught not as a question, but as a certainty, and children learned to repeat the correct answers with confidence and pride. Critical thinking was not the goal. Memorization, loyalty, and clarity were the pillars of a good student. Patriotic songs echoed through hallways as students practiced for parades and school events. Their voices blended in unity as they sang about fields of wheat, heroes of the people, and the future built by their own hands. Physical education was also a vital part of schooling. Children ran laps around snow-covered playgrounds, climbed wooden bars, and learned team games that encouraged cooperation and discipline. Strong bodies were just as important as strong minds. In the building of a socialist society, art and music were not neglected. Paintings of Soviet achievements hung on classroom walls, and students learned to sing folk songs, play simple instruments, or draw posters praising labor and peace. In special clubs, students joined activities like chess, drama, model building, or journalism. These clubs were sometimes led by teachers or older students and gave children a sense of purpose outside of regular lessons. Participation was expected, and excellence was rewarded with certificates. Praise, and in some cases public recognition at school assemblies, was served in the school canteen, where rows of metal tables and benches stretched under flickering lights. Children lined up with trays and received ladles of soup, slices of bread, stewed vegetables, and sweetened tea served in thick glasses. Sometimes a small sweet treat, like a piece of jelly candy or fruit compote, made the meal special. The food was not fancy, but it was filling and prepared with the same efficiency found in factories and offices. Homework followed children home like a shadow. After school, they returned to their apartments, removed their uniforms, and sat at kitchen tables or tiny desks, completing exercises and copying lessons while their parents prepared dinner. The television might be off or turned down low as the child concentrated under the watchful eye of a parent or grandparent. Mistakes were corrected and lessons repeated as needed, because academic success was not optional. It was a duty. Weekends offered a slight change of pace, but they too were filled with activities. Children attended pioneer meetings, cleaned public spaces during youth sabbatniks, helped parents with household chores, or visited museums, parks, or cultural centers. School excursions took them to historic battlefields, industrial plants, or art galleries, where guides explained the significance of each item in a voice filled with pride and certainty. For entertainment, children turned to books, comics, toys, and games. Though choices were limited, creativity flourished. A child might build toy tanks from cardboard, make dolls from cloth or stage, elaborate adventures with friends, using sticks as swords and pine cones as grenades. Television offered a few hours of programming, mostly educational, cartoons, puppet shows, and documentaries. Often the most exciting moments came not from screens, but from the shared stories and jokes whispered between siblings. Late at night, children's books held a special place in Soviet culture. Characters like Neznayka, the curious boy from the Flower City, or Chipolino, the onion boy, who fought for justice, filled pages with color, humor, and moral lessons. Tales from Russian folklore were retold with a Soviet flavor, always highlighting the values of courage, honesty, and collective spirit. A good book was treasured and passed from child to child, worn pages and all. Despite the pressure, children found joy in the ordinary. Snowball fights on icy mornings, jumping into puddles during spring thaws, chasing fireflies on summer nights, and watching the first snowfall of winter cover the world in silent white wonder. These moments transcended ideology. They were universal joys of childhood, and they lived in the hearts of every Soviet child, no matter the size of their apartment or the weight of their satchel. Holidays were some of the most anticipated moments in a child's year. New Year was especially magical, with decorated fir trees handmade, paper snowflakes, and the arrival of Ded Moroz, the Soviet equivalent of Santa Claus, who brought gifts and laughter. Children performed in school plays, reciting poems and songs dressed as snowflakes, foxes, bears, or cosmonauts. School auditoriums echoed with clapping as parents watched proudly, and teachers smiled with restrained satisfaction. Children's voices filled courtyards and stairwells across the nation. Their laughter was the soundtrack of resilience. They knew the rules of their world, and they learned how to live within them. They obeyed their teachers, respected their elders, and dreamed quietly of a future where they might become astronauts, engineers, teachers, or poets. Even those dreams were shaped by the system. The goal was not personal fame, but collective achievement, to become part of something greater, to contribute to the glory of the Union, to build a tomorrow that was fair, strong, and shared. Childhood in the Soviet Union was structured, disciplined, and filled with expectations, but it was also rich with memory, meaning, and moments of spontaneous joy. It was a time of preparation, but also of discovery, a delicate balance of duty and imagination. After long hours at work or school, after the lines at stores and the chores at home, every Soviet citizen craved one simple thing: a moment to breathe, a pause, a space to laugh, dream, relax, and escape. That space was not always easy to find, but it was always created through the power of Soviet leisure culture. The state knew that a productive worker needed rest, and it carefully shaped the ways people unwound, shaping relaxation into something that served the system while also offering real moments of comfort and joy. The most common and accessible form of entertainment was the radio. Almost every home had one, whether it was built into the wall of a Khrushchevka apartment or sitting on a small wooden shelf in a rural hut. Radios delivered music, plays, news, and speeches, all regulated but often enjoyed. The familiar voices of radio hosts filled kitchens and living rooms with songs from the Red Army Choir, tales of wartime heroes, and sometimes soft melodies played late at night that soothed tired minds and sent children off to sleep. Television was a growing presence by the 70s and 80s, though still limited. Compared to the West, black and white screens, flickered with carefully chosen programming. Evening shows might include state-approved films, nature documentaries, ballet performances, or patriotic dramas that highlighted the strength of workers, soldiers, and party leaders. Children waited eagerly for cartoons like New Pagodi, a slapstick comedy about a mischievous wolf and a clever hare, which became iconic across generations. Movie theaters were popular gathering places for both young and old. Ticket prices were affordable, and the buildings themselves often impressive, with grand lobbies, velvet curtains, and decorative ceilings. The film schedule included Soviet classics, historical epics, comedies, and occasionally imported films from friendly countries like India, Cuba, or East Germany. Watching a film was more than just fun. It was an event. Friends met outside the theater with sunflower seeds or candies in their pockets, chatting about the actors or guessing the plot before the film even began. Cinema served many purposes. It reinforced ideals, it offered escape, and it gave people something to talk about on Monday morning. Films like The Cranes Are Flying or Ballad of a Soldier moved audiences to tears, while comedies like Ivan Vasilievich Changes Profession filled rooms with laughter. Families left theaters walking slowly under street lamps, discussing scenes, moments, and lessons, often applying them to their own lives in subtle, unspoken ways. Books were a cherished escape, and reading was deeply woven into Soviet life. Libraries stood proudly in every neighborhood, filled with shelves Of literature, science, history, and ideology, card catalogs stretched across wooden desks, and librarians moved between aisles in silence. Readers signed up for waiting lists just to get their hands on popular titles, classic Russian authors like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Pushkin were read alongside Soviet writers who portrayed the workers' struggle and the triumph of socialism. For those who loved poetry, a quiet evening might involve reading verses aloud with family or friends. Poems by Mayakovsky, Tverdovsky, or Akhmatova echoed across generations. Their words carried both official approval and hidden meanings that stirred emotions deeper than slogans. Reading became a quiet rebellion for some, a loyal habit for others, and always a gateway into other worlds. Whether imagined or remembered, music filled homes and hearts. Across the Union, gramophones spun records of folk tunes, military marches, and even a few jazz compositions when allowed street musicians strummed guitars in underpasses. Young people gathered to play harmonicas in courtyards, and school children learned patriotic songs in classrooms. While Western music was censored, it still slipped through the cracks. Bootleg recordings of the Beatles or ABBA passed hand to hand, hidden in blank covers or taped over official cassette labels. Dancing was another outlet. Social dances took place in clubs, cultural centers, or outdoor pavilions during the warmer months. Boys wore collared shirts, girls wore modest dresses, and together they moved to waltzes, polkas, or more modern rhythms under string lights and fading sunsets. These gatherings were monitored, of course, but they were still real. Expressions of joy, nervous flirtation, and youthful hope. Sport played a central role in both leisure and national pride. Stadiums echoed with cheers as citizens watched football matches, ice hockey games, and gymnastics tournaments. State television broadcasted the Olympic Games, and Soviet victories were celebrated with fireworks parades and emotional speeches. Children admired athletes like gymnast Olga Korbut or ice skater Irina Rodnina, dreaming of becoming champions themselves. Sports clubs opened their doors to the public, encouraging people of all ages to swim, run, lift, and stretch. Weekend trips offered another kind of leisure. The Soviet tradition of the dasha, a small countryside house, became a cherished part of life. Families who could secure a plot of land grew vegetables, relaxed in hammocks, or gathered around outdoor tables, sipping tea from samovars and watching bees dance among sunflowers. Dashas were not luxurious, but they offered a deep sense of peace, a return to nature, and a small escape from the structured routines of city life. Trains carried millions across the vast Soviet landscape, whether for vacation work or family visits. The sound of the wheels clicking on the rails, the samovar at the end of the carriage, the quiet conversations between strangers, all became part of the travel experience. Tickets were affordable, and sleeper cars offered a rare chance to see new places, relax in motion, and feel the immensity of the homeland stretching beyond the horizon. Public celebrations were enormous and well-orchestrated. May Day, Victory Day, and Revolution Day brought citizens to the streets, waving flags, holding portraits of heroes, and marching in parades that combined genuine pride with required participation. School children held balloons, workers carried signs with slogans, and military bands filled the air with thunderous music. Red banners flew from windows, speeches echoed through loudspeakers, and for a few hours, the hardships of life faded beneath the weight of collective celebration. Cultural centers known as Dom Kultury became hubs for learning and fun. They hosted dance classes, music lessons, chess tournaments, art exhibitions, and lectures. For young people, they offered youth clubs where friendships formed and romances blossomed under the watchful gaze of assigned supervisors. For older citizens, they became places to sing in choirs, learn languages, or join book clubs, all within the safety and structure of state oversight. Even simple pleasures were treasured. Ice cream bought from a street cart in summer with 3 flavors to choose from: vanilla, chocolate, and plombier. A walk through a park filled with blooming lilacs. A game of dominoes played by pensioners at a quiet table in the courtyard. a visit to the zoo or circus with Sticky, candy in hand and eyes wide with wonder. These moments did not need approval or planning. They happened naturally and stayed in memory for years. Leisure was never separate from ideology. The party encouraged rest, but shaped its form cultural programming, promoted moral values, hard work, and socialist pride. Still within these boundaries, people found ways to make joy personal, to carve out moments of calm laughter and dreaming that belonged entirely to them. What mattered most was not the luxury of the experience, but the connection it created. Friends sitting side by side on a park bench, families watching a film by candlelight after a power outage, children reading under the covers with a flashlight and imagining galaxies far away. These were the quiet miracles of everyday Soviet life. In the end, leisure in the Soviet Union was both a gift and a compromise. It was planned and monitored, shaped, and sometimes censored, but it was also real and essential. It gave people space to hope, to feel human, and to connect with one another in ways that no system could fully control. And through those moments, no matter how structured or simple, Soviet citizens found ways to live, not just to function, but to truly live.